Cliff, you're muted.
Okay. Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research and learning center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've had to discontinue our in-person events and instituted these online webinars instead. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our local staff. You can donate at www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program features Nancy Frazer, who will be talking about her new book, Cannibal Capitalism. Now, capital is currently cannibalizing every sphere of life, guzzling wealth from nature and racialized populations, sucking up our ability to care for one another, and gutting the practice of politics. In this tightly argued and urgent volume, Nancy Frazer charts the voracious appetite of capital, tracking it from crisis point to crisis point, from ecological devastation to the collapse of democracy, from racial violence to the devaluation of work care. These crises all come to the head in COVID-19, which she argues can help us envision the resistance we need to end the feeding frenzy. And Cannibal Capitalism, how our system is devouring democracy, care, and the planet, and what we can do about it, is Nancy Frazer's newest book. She's also published The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born, Redistribution or Reconstruction, a Political Philosophical Exchange, Scales of Justice, Reimagining Political Space in a Globalizing World, Justice Interruptus, Critical Reflections on the Post-Socialist Condition, and Capitalism, a Conversation in Critical Theory. Nancy's been a very prolific author, and we're delighted to have her with us again. After her presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to make your comments and raise questions. So let me give the floor now to Nancy.
Thanks so much, Cliff. It's a pleasure to be there. I'm only sorry I couldn't come to this wonderful place where you are in person. I still hope to do that at some point. But anyway, it's good that we have this technology and can communicate even in this remote form. So yeah, my book is called Cannibal Capitalism. I'm going to hold up a copy so you can see this beautiful cover that Verso has designed. The image is the Ouroboros, the surface that eats its own tail, but drawn here as in gold leaf, as if it were some kind of a strange symbol of currency. So it's the moneyed serpent eating its own tail. And that's the central idea of the book, in fact. I start from the assumption that we are now living through a truly acute general crisis of the current social order, the whole civilizational order, meaning it's not simply a sectoral crisis, not merely an economic crisis, not merely a crisis of work, not merely an ecological crisis, a political crisis, a moral and social crisis, but all of the above, all these strands tangled up together inextricably, exacerbating one another in a kind of huge hot mess. And in fact, I believe that crises of this sort are quite rare in capitalism's history. There have only been a handful in 500 years. The last one of this magnitude came in the 1930s and resulted in the reinvention of capitalism, let's say, in a new social democratic or state developmentalist form. And we can't know now what the outcome of this crisis will be. There are possibly some reasons for doubting whether this crisis can be resolved by the invention of a new form of capitalism. I think the climate dimension of the crisis raises, in the most obvious way, some serious questions about whether a new form of capitalism is conceivable that could decarbonize the world economy quickly and in time. Anyway, we can't know about that for sure now, but we can at least analyze what's going on in a way that helps clarify the situation. And that's what I've tried to do in the book. Let me say a few words first about the two terms in the title, cannibalism and capitalism. And then I want to say a little bit about COVID, which I think has been a kind of perfect storm, a textbook illustration of this convergence of all of these crisis strands in the present moment. But let me first start with cannibalism. That term has quite a few different meanings, and the most obvious one, the most familiar one that will occur to you right off the bat is the ritual eating of human flesh by a human being. That's a somewhat ironic meaning from my point of view, because it's obviously burdened by a long racist history. Cannibalism in this sense was a derogatory term applied to Black Africans who were on the receiving end of Euro-imperial predation. And so, it's a kind of reversal, who's actually eating whom. Now, that gives me a certain satisfaction in trying to reverse the term back and use it now as a descriptor for the capitalist class, which I argue in this book is basically making a meal now of everybody else. But that's the most superficial level. There are also, I think, more abstract and maybe deeper notions of cannibalism that I want to draw on here. One of these is that, here's a dictionary definition. The verb cannibalize, the dictionary tells us, means to deprive one facility or enterprise of an essential element of its functioning for the purpose of creating or sustaining another facility or enterprise. And that, I'm going to suggest, is a very good description of how capitalism's economy relates to the system's non-economic background conditions, to families and communities, to habitats and ecosystems, to state capacities and public powers. These are all necessary background conditions for the accumulation and profiteering that comprises the heart of a capitalist economy, yet they are all cannibalized by that economy. And so that's the depriving one facility or enterprise of its sustenance in order to sustain the other ones. Finally, there's a specialized astronomical meaning of cannibalize. Astronomers tell us that a celestial object cannibalizes another such object when it incorporates mass from the latter through gravitational attraction. And that, I think, is a beautiful characterization of the process by which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system. So here are a whole set of meanings of this term capitalism, which I think are very, indicate a lot of promising lines for analyzing the capitalist system. It gives us, this metaphor invites us to see our society as a kind of institutionalized feeding frenzy in which the main course, unfortunately, is us. Well, so much for cannibalism. Now I need to say something about capitalism. And that word also cries out for clarification. It's often used to name an economic system, right? Based on private property, market exchange, wage labor, production for profit. But I think this economistic definition of capitalism is much too narrow. It obscures some important features of the system's true nature. I argue in this book that the word capitalism designates something much bigger, a societal order, not an economy, but a larger societal order that empowers a profit-driven economy, that incentivizes powerful economic actors to prey on the extra economic supports that they need to function. And these supports, and I'll say more about this shortly, are wealth expropriated from nature and from subject peoples, multiple forms of care work, chronically undervalued when not wholly disavowed, public goods and public powers, which capital both requires and tries to curtail the energy and creativity of working people. None of these things appear on corporate balance sheets, but they are forms of wealth that are essential preconditions for the profits that do appear on those balance sheets. And in my book, then, they are vital underpinnings of accumulation and therefore constitutive components of the capitalist order. We don't have a capitalist order without these things. So in my book, the term capitalism refers not to a type of economy, but to a type of society. A society that authorizes its officially designated economy to pile up monetized value for investors and owners while devouring the non-economized wealth of everyone else. It serves up that wealth on a platter to the corporate classes, inviting them, as I said, to make a meal of our creative capacities and of the earth that sustains us, with no obligation whatever to replenish what they consume or to repair what they damage. And of course, that is a recipe for trouble. Like the Ouroboros that eats its own tail, capitalist society is primed to devour its own substance. It's a veritable dynamo of self-destabilization, which periodically precipitates crises, while also routinely eating away at the bases of our existence. So that's my view of capitalism. It's a view that sees it as having an inherent cannibalizing dynamic that dynamic does not always erupt in a visible way in the form of an acute crisis, but from time to time it does. And I would say that the last 40 years of neoliberal or financialized capitalism have sharpened that cannibalizing dynamic to a fever pitch and precipitated what I call this general trans-sectoral crisis, multidimensional crisis in its very acute form. I think I can illustrate that proposition by talking a little bit about the COVID pandemic. And here I'm drawing on parts of the epilogue of the book. Most of this book was written long before the outbreak of the pandemic. But if there was anything heartening about the pandemic, and I can't say there really was, it felt to me like a vindication of the argument of the book. What my thought was that the pandemic was almost like a convergence point, a point where all of the cannibalizing tendencies met. The cannibalization of nature, the cannibalization of social reproduction or care, the cannibalization of public goods and political powers, the cannibalization of the wealth and health of racialized peoples, the cannibalization of the energies and creativities of all working people. So let me try to spell that out for you. I want to start with nature, because it was capital's cannibalization of nature, that vital support of its own existence and of ours, that exposed humans to SARS-CoV-2 in the first place. That's the virus that causes COVID-19, and it was long harbored, we now know, by bats in remote caves. It made the zoonotic leap to us in 2019 by way of some bridging species. We don't know for sure which. One hypothesis has been pangolins. I'm leaving aside the lab leak theory, which I believe is discredited, but that's, maybe we could talk about that. Anyway, a bridge. So we don't really know what brought the bats, what was the intermediary, right, between the bats and us. But we do know what brought the bats into contact with that intermediary species, whatever it was. And we do know what brought the latter into contact with us, namely the combined effects of global warming on the one hand and of tropical deforestation on the other hand. And it's also clear that both of those processes were brought to us courtesy of capital, right? Being driven by its insatiable hunger for profit. Together, global warming and tropical deforestation have eviscerated the habitats of innumerable species, triggering mass migrations, creating new proximities among previously distanced but now distressed organisms, promoting novel transfers of pathogens among them. That dynamic had already precipitated a string of viral epidemics, HIV, Nipah, SARS, MERS, etc. And more of these are certain to come. They are the non-accidental byproducts of a societal order that puts nature at the mercy of capital. Incentivized to appropriate biophysical wealth as quickly and cheaply as possible, with no responsibility for repair or replenishment, those dedicated to amassing profit decimate rainforests and bombard the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Hell-bent on accumulation in every era, but massively empowered by neoliberalization, they have let loose an escalating cascade of lethal plagues. Well, COVID's effects on humans would be horrific under any condition, but they have been made incalculably worse by another strand of the present crisis rooted in another structural contradiction of capitalist society, which has also been sharpened to a fever pitch in the neoliberal era. In other words, it's not just nature that capital has cannibalized in this period, but also public power. That too is an essential ingredient of its diet, one that is avidly consumed in every phase of the system's development, but has been devoured with special ferocity in the last 40 years. And that's the rub. The political capacities on which financialized capital has gorged, which it has hollowed out, are precisely those we could have used to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, but no such luck. Well, before the COVID outbreak, most states had bowed to the demands of what they call the markets, really financial capital, by slashing social spending, including on public health infrastructure and basic research. With a few exceptions, notably Cuba, these states drew down stockpiles of life-saving equipment. They gutted diagnostic capacities, shrank coordination and treatment capacities, and having eviscerated public health infrastructure, our rulers devolved vital healthcare functions to profit-driven providers and insurers, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturers. These firms, which after all are constitutionally uninterested and unconstrained by the public interest, now control the lion's share of the world's health-related labor forces and raw materials, machinery and production facilities, supply chains and intellectual property, research institutions and personnel, everything, in other words, which together determines our fates, individual and collective. Committed to the preservation of their profit streams, these firms form a private force majeure that blocks concerted public action on behalf of humanity. The effects are tragic, but not surprising. A social system that subjects matters of life and death to the law of value was structurally primed from the get-go to abandon untold millions to COVID-19. But that's not all. The collapse of already weak public systems converged with another structural contradiction of capitalist society, one centered on social reproduction. Always a staple of capital's consumption, care work has been voraciously gobbled up by it in recent years. After all, the same regime that divested from public care infrastructure also broke unions and drove down wages, compelling increased hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers. Offloading care work onto families and communities while siphoning off the energies needed to perform it, neoliberalism turned capitalism's inherent tendency to destabilize social reproduction into an acute care crunch. COVID's advent intensified this strand of crisis too, dumping major new care chores on families and communities, especially onto women who still do the lion's share of unpaid care work. As we know, under lockdown, childcare and schooling shifted into people's homes, leaving parents to take on that burden on top of others in confined domestic spaces, not well suited to those purposes. Many employed women ended up quitting their jobs to care for kids and other relatives. Many others were laid off by employers. Both those groups face major losses in position and pay if and when they rejoin the workforce. A third group privileged to keep their jobs and work remotely from home while also performing care work, had to take multitasking to new heights of craziness. A fourth group, not strictly delimited by gender, was given the honorific title essential workers, but were paid a pittance and treated as disposable, required to brave the threat of infection daily, along with the fear of bringing it home, in order to produce and distribute the stuff that has enabled others to shelter in place. Now, in each of these cases, the work of social reproduction, now swollen by the pandemic, still fell largely to women, as it had in every phase of capitalism's history. But which women ended up in which category depended on class and color. So let's look at the racial dimension of all this. Structural racism has been central to every phase of capitalism's development, and the present is no exception. Contra some left-wing orthodoxies, capital accumulation proceeds not only by exploiting doubly free wage workers, but also by expropriating dependent populations who've been stripped of political power and actionable rights. This distinction, the distinction between exploitation and expropriation, corresponds to what W.E.B. Du Bois called the global color line. A built-in feature of capitalist society, racial imperial predation infuses every aspect of the current crisis. At the global level, it colors the geography of ecological devastation as capital quenches its thirst for cheap nature, Jason Moore's phrase, largely by seizing land, energy, and mineral wealth from racialized populations. Populations who've been deprived of the means of self-defense, having been subject to conquest, enslavement, genocide, or dispossession, and who now bear an undue share of the global environmental load. Disproportionately vulnerable to toxic dumping, so-called natural disasters, and multiple lethal impacts of global warming, these populations now found themselves last in line for vaccination and therapeutics. At the national level, too, color inflected the political and social reproductive strands of the crisis. As racialized populations in many countries were denied access to conditions that promote health and still are, denied access to affordable, high-quality medical care, to clean water, nutritious food, safe working and living conditions. No wonder then that their members have been disproportionately infected and killed by COVID. Hardly mysterious, the reasons are poverty and inferior healthcare, pre-existing medical conditions linked to stress, poor nutrition, and exposure to toxins, overrepresentation in frontline jobs that cannot be performed remotely, lack of resources and labor rights that would permit them to refuse unsafe work, inferior housing and living conditions that don't allow for social distancing and that facilitate transmission, and again, diminished access to treatment and vaccines. Together, those conditions expanded the meaning of the slogan, Black Lives Matter, synergizing with its original reference to police violence and helping to fuel massive protests in 2020. Color, though, is deeply entwined with class in the capitalist world system generally, and in the present period particularly. In fact, the two are really inseparable, as that category essential worker shows. If we leave aside medical professionals, that designation, essential worker, covers migrant farm workers, immigrant meat packing and slaughterhouse workers, Amazon warehouse pickers, UPS delivery drivers, nursing home aides, hospital cleaners, supermarket stockers and cashiers, gig workers who deliver groceries and take out meals. Especially dangerous in COVID times. These jobs are low-paid, non-unionized, precarious, bereft of benefits and of labor protections. They are subject to intrusive supervision and control. They offer little autonomy or prospect for advancement and skill acquisition. They are also disproportionately filled by women and people of color. Taken together, these jobs and those who perform them represent the face of the working class in the 21st century. No longer epitomized by the figure of the white male miner, factory operative, or construction worker, that class now consists paradigmatically of care workers, gig workers, and low-wage service workers. They are paid less than the cost of their reproduction when they are paid at all, hence are expropriated as well as exploited. COVID exposed that dirty secret as well by juxtaposing the essential character of that class's work to capital's systematic undervaluation of it. The pandemic testified to another major defect of capitalist society, the inability of markets in labor power to accurately reckon the real worth of work. So, in general, I'm arguing that COVID is a kind of orgy of capitalist irrationality and injustice, a flashpoint where all of the system's cannibalizing tendencies converge. By ratcheting up the system's inherent defects to the breaking point, it shined a piercing beam on all of the so-called hidden abodes, as I call them, of capitalist society. Dragging these hidden abodes out from the shadows and into the daylight, the pandemic revealed capitalism's multiple structural contradictions for all to see. It showed capitalism's inherent drive to cannibalize nature up to the very brink of planetary conflagration, its drive to divert our capacities away from the truly essential work of social reproduction, its drive to eviscerate public powers to the point where they cannot solve the problems the system generates, its drive to feed off the ever-decreasing wealth and health of racialized peoples to not only exploit, but also expropriate the working class. In truth, I think we could not ask for a better lesson in social theory. But now comes the hard part, putting that lesson to work in social practice. It's time to figure out how to starve the beast and put an end once and for all to cannibal capitalism. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nancy, for a very interesting presentation. And I'm sure that we'll all be looking forward to reading your book. If you have any questions or comments, you can, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can get those to us by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And of course, if you're in the Zoom room with us, you can put your question directly. So just raise your hand and I'll call on you.
It looks like Karsten has his hand up.
Okay, I see Kostis Papadantonakis. Go ahead, Kostis.
Thank you. And thank you for this beautiful presentation of your great book. I'm part of a study group here in Baltimore, a group where once Cliff actually was sort of a member and many years ago. And one question that came up in discussing your book, which we have been doing piecemeal, we're right in the middle of it right now, was that the dimensions that you discussed, which run parallel to the classical Marxist analysis of capitalism, refer to forms of differentiation, otherness, and oppression that have existed long before the emergence of capitalism. There is disagreement about that. I personally don't consider this a valid criticism. I'm not sure where it means to lead, but I would very much appreciate your comments.
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for evoking the site of Baltimore, which is my hometown, by the way, and where in my youth I had many wonderful reading groups, including with David Harvey when he was writing The Limits to Capital at Hopkins. So I go way back to that tradition. Yeah, well, you know, not all. I mean, I would treat several different forms of oppression differently. I don't think they're all the same. It seems to be pretty uncontroversial to say that male domination has existed in one form or another long before capitalism. So we can't say that capitalism created male domination in general, but I'm not so interested in male domination in general. I'm interested in the forms that male domination takes in capitalist society, and those are very historically specific. No previous society institutionalized a sharp separation between production and reproduction in the way that capitalism does. And that has become a fundamental institutional structural feature of the society, every bit as structural as the division between property ownership and propertyless workers, so to speak. So irrespective of the pre-existence of male domination in other forms, in other societies, my claim would be that this is the form we need to focus on now. And I would argue that there really isn't any way to overcome gender asymmetry and women's subordination today that does not transform the relation between production and reproduction. Whether that's a sufficient condition is another question, but it's at the very least a necessary condition. Race, I think, is quite different. I'd appreciate that there is debate, but my view, for what it's worth, is that racial oppression is specific to capitalism, that the forms of ethnic antagonism, ancient slavery, for example, and group intergroup animosity that existed before capitalism are not racist in the strong sense, the analytical sense of, grounded in the assumption of a permanent stain that is either in the blood or in the genes or in some allegedly unchangeable feature. It comes out in capitalism specifically as a counter to the other idea of capitalism of a thin kind of equality in the Enlightenment. That when you say all men are created equal, and now we see that we're enslaving some of them, you need a pretty strong rationale for saying why it's okay to ignore this contradiction. And that rationale is the invention of race in the modern sense, in the modern biologistic sense. So I think that's a different idea than in ethnic antagonisms prior to capitalism. And in here too, and what I spoke about this global color line that maps on to the structural division between expropriation and exploitation. That's how I understand it's sort of almost analogous to production reproduction. Capitalism is built on these divisions, and just as production reproduction division is the ultimate structural basis of gender asymmetry in capitalism, so the exploitation expropriation division is the fundamental structural basis, in my view, of racial oppression. I could say something about ecology very quickly. It's obviously there have been environmental disasters prior to capitalism. We know of all of ancient empires that over planted their lands or deforested mountaintops and caused horrific flooding and so on and so forth. But I don't believe that those cases reflected any sort of structural dynamic that was hardwired in the society. What I think is specific to capitalism, and as far as I know, only to capitalism, at least so far in human history, is precisely the hardwired incentive to trash nature. It's this dynamic of, as I said, appropriating as much biophysical wealth as quickly as possible and disclaiming all responsibility for repair and replenishment. So here too, are we guaranteed a sustainable, healthy, socio-ecological life form after capitalism? Maybe not. But getting rid of capitalism is at least a necessary, if not a sufficient condition for getting to that. So that's the answer in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Carson has his hand up. Carson Struhl.
First, good to see you, Nancy, and congratulations on the book. I just got the book and I started reading it. And maybe the questions I'm about to ask are in the latter parts of the book, but since you're here, I will ask them. So I'm really interested, I like the metaphor, I should say, of cannibalization. I'm interested in the distinction you're making between capitalism as an economic form and capitalism as a social form, which preys upon the non-economic. So, which allows the economic order to prey upon the non-economic. So the question in my mind is, in one sense, theoretical, but I think it has practical implications. Where's the line? So there's something called the economic order within the social order, something else which is not the economic order within the social order, and the social order, not the economic order, allows the economic order to prey on the non-economic parts of the social order. How do you understand that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carson, and it's nice to see you too. Even though we both live in New York and teach at the same institution, we have to go on Zoom via Mexico to see each other. Funny. Anyway, let me just start by saying that I wrote a little paper a while back that summarizes something important about what I'm doing here. The paper had the title, "Two Karls Are Better Than One." And that I mean Polanyi and Marx. I'm really trying to synthesize some of the insights of both of them. I basically accept Marx's analysis in Capital of at least, as far as it goes, how the accumulation dynamic works, how expanded reproduction works, and so on and so forth. But that leads us to focus on the economic subsystem of the society and to locate the contradictions within that subsystem, falling rate of profit and so on. Whereas Polanyi, the other Karl, was interested in the contradiction in capitalism between the economy and society, as he called it. And I think both are true. And what I'm trying to do is try to figure out a way to integrate the two insights and put them together, the two ways of framing this. So you ask, where is the line? And the line is not drawn and fixed once and for all. First of all, there's more than one line. There's the line between production and reproduction. There's the line between society and nature. There's the line between markets and states. There's the line between expropriation and exploitation. I'm trying to give a sense that the social order is internally differentiated. All capitalist societies draw these lines that I just enumerated, but they don't always draw them in exactly the same place. And historically, those lines have shifted. And I think that these lines are actually sites of struggle. And this is part of my argument about so-called boundary struggles. We know from Marx that capitalist societies non-accidentally generate class struggles, it's part of their specific grammar of social conflict. Absolutely correct. However, I'm arguing that capitalist societies also generate what I call boundary struggles over exactly where and how to draw the line between production and reproduction, markets and states, nature and society. We're arguing right now in a very intense way, more than in earlier times, about that society-nature line. Where does responsibility stop and start? And in my view, as long as the answer is green capitalism, we're not solving anything. But that's neither here nor there. So the lines are not fixed, and I think that these crisis moments that I referred to earlier, and one of which we're in now, are when they do get resolved, the form the resolution takes is some redrawing of those lines. That's what so-called New Deal or social democratic or developmental state capitalism did vis-a-vis the previous form. It's what neoliberalism did vis-a-vis the social democratic form. And it's what, if and when there can be a capitalist resolution to the present crisis, one that really succeeds in not overcoming, by definition, they'll never overcome these contradictions, but one that succeeds in softening them, diffusing them, finessing them for a while, at least for some significant subset of the population, that subset who are taken to count, who can't be ignored, if there can be such a thing, and I'm not at all sure there can be or will be, it will redraw those lines as well in some new way. So I'm trying to allow for the historicity of capitalism, but also to say something general and, if you like, transhistorical, not transhistorical for all of history, but for capitalist history, about what the basic building blocks are, and to say that it's more than the division between those who have only their labor power and those who own the means of production. that there are these other really, and I'm also, the other thing I'm trying to do here that's important is, at least I think it's important, is I'm trying to take the idea that capitalism is a social order seriously without falling into what I think is the dead end of a lot of Frankfurt School theorizing, which saw it as the totalization of the commodity form, one-dimensional society, the totally administered society. I'm trying to show that how non-commodities are as essential to this system as commodities. And that it's not that more and more is getting commodified until there's nothing else. Then you would be in the Polanyi problem. Society cannot be commodities all the way down. I think Polanyi was right about that. So anyway, that's the you're asking a deep and difficult question, and I'm giving you my best shot at a quick
Can I
answer.
do a follow-up on just a specific sphere? That's okay. So, I mean, let's think about the ecological crisis. So capitalism from its beginning, you even talked about in the manifesto, invades every life space, which means it invades every geographical region and takes over in various ways. So is there any part of the ecosystem that is extra economic at this point? I mean, and I say that feeling that there is, but I don't know quite how to do it, except that, you know, we may all be doomed and that's going to be extra economic.
I have like two different thoughts about this. I mean, I would say there is nothing outside of capitalism, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing outside the capitalist economy,
Okay.
which is, after all, is smaller than capitalism. Okay. It's common in a lot of literature, Marxist literature now, to distinguish between those forms of wealth that are directly incorporated into the accumulation circuits and subjected to them, monetized, capitalized, commodified, and those that are within capital's reach, but are not monetized, commodified, what did I just say? Capitalized.
Not yet.
No, well, listen, that's that was going to be my next point. The picture is not, in my view, the picture is not yet in the sense that everything eventually will be. I think the system expels as much as it incorporates. It's a constant dance between taking in some stuff and spitting out other stuff and people. So I wouldn't say that capitalism invades, or the capitalist economy, let's be careful. I wouldn't say that the economy invades every single space. It invades those spaces that it finds it can make hay out of. And sometimes it makes hay out of them and just trashes them so badly that it spits them out and makes them into what Saskia Sassen would call dead zones, right? So I on this, I'm kind of more on Rosa Luxemburg's side of this debate, that, you know, that it's kind of needs the outside. What I mean by the outside is not exactly what she meant by the outside, but I think that the basic intuition is the same. And I think we can very well, it's, you know, determine, and people who do much more empirical research and so on than I do. I'm kind of one of these armchair, you know, philosopher types, but I think people can actually tell you what is monetized and what isn't, and what the trends are in the way of incorporation versus expulsion.
We have a question from one of our YouTube viewers, Doug Morris, and he is referencing pages 146, 147, where you mention the three chief wrongs in the narrow view of capitalism. In critiquing capitalism, might we also add immoral to what you note? The injustice of class exploitation, the irrationality of repeated economic crisis, and unfreedom linked to the undermining of democracy through social inequality and class power. I also support immorality or also suppose immorality is already contained in the injustice, irrationality, and unfreedom. As I understand Marx's morality, simply put, it was rooted not so much in obedience to laws and prohibitions, but more to enjoyment and fulfillment in life. Hence the emphasis on creative leisure in contrast to capital's onerous labor. Capital's immorality is then seen in how it creates a grotesque inequality in access to the social conditions, material resources, and community means necessary for people to live meaningful, fulfilling, creative, enjoyable, and flourishing lives. That access is surely one of the goals of socialism, which you explore in the latter section of the book. So Doug Morris asked you,
Right.
do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, thank you very much, Doug. It's a really elegantly elaborated question and a very important one. So I would distinguish between. I think we agree that that capitalism is unjust, irrational, and what was my other third one? Whatever it was that you mentioned there. Right now, I'm forgetting. But I would distinguish between. I think what you're raising is unfreedom is my third one. Yeah, I think you're raising the question. I wouldn't call it so much immorality as badness. Capitalism is just bad for living beings, and of the human sort as well as others. It brings a somewhat like deformed way of living that it doesn't permit people to develop their talents and interests. It doesn't permit rich and emotionally fulfilling social relationships and so on and so forth. We know this kind of critique. So there are 2 points. One is that part of that critique is an injustice critique, insofar as it's saying that certain people, especially large numbers of people, especially, have their lives stunted and deformed and made bad in that way. So that it's about the disparate, right, access to a good life. But part of it is general. We would say that even privileged people are living in a sort of grammar of life that is fundamentally a bad one and not a good one. The problem with this, and there's a beautiful discussion of this question by Rahel Yagi in our co-authored book, Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory. I don't know if you people know that, but Yagi, who is a brilliant German Marxist philosopher, develops a beautiful account of this kind of a critique and of the problems with the way it's been traditionally articulated. The problem, in a nutshell, as liberals would say, is that it's sectarian. It assumes we already know what a good life is, and therefore what a bad life is, and that somehow there's a way of defending one interpretation of good versus bad life over all the other ones, because after all, people disagree and have disagreed about this question forever. So to sort of avoid this taking on a kind of critique that is very hard to vindicate when you're in a situation of what, the Rawlsian would call plurality of views of the good life. It's a heavy burden of justification. And I don't think Marxists and socialists need to take on that burden at least as theorists. Socialist citizens will need to figure out how to deal with that problem. But I don't think there's a theoretical answer that I would feel comfortable throwing, my arguments behind. And that's why I do the freedom critique. I think the freedom critique is an alternative. The freedom critique is that capitalism deprives us of the conditions, the opportunities, the ability to actually evaluate, criticize, and redesign our form of life. The basic grammar of our form of life is set by basically the small class of investors and owners who are monopolizing the right to the capacity to say what our relation to nature should be. They are monopolizing our capacity to say what the relation between family and work life, non-familial work life should be. They are monopolizing our ability to say what the relation between production and political organization should be, et cetera, et cetera. So we're deprived of the freedom, the collective capacity of collective self-determination to even think about and decide these things. And that process would, I think, have to include coming to some kind of agreement over these judgments of good life versus bad life. But again, I don't think that's a theoretical question, in the sense of something a theorist can answer. As a citizen, I might be able to give you my views, but I would be in the realm of give and take, and I wouldn't have the confidence that I was absolutely right, that living as a kind of isolated monk on a mountaintop is a good way of life or a bad way of life. I think we want actually a society in which people can make different choices about these things, but only, of course, insofar as they don't ruin it for everyone else, which is the problem we have now. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Kostis Papadontanakis has a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you. Just now, incidentally, your answer made me have a much better understanding of what good old Hobbes meant by the sovereign. In which case it is those investors who are the sovereign. And the question is, you discuss in your book how those decisions about what belongs where, this game which draws the line and redraws the lines between the various categories that you identify, are really, those lines are the centers of contradictions, and contradictions are to be fought. And so it's the whole question of struggle, to exactly in the Gramscian sense of contesting sovereignty, contesting the role of the hegemon, that is, contesting the definition of what is the problem, what should be the problem, which is not only a moral question, but a question of mobilization. I find that as one of the greatest contributions in your analysis that focuses on that. And I wonder if you would like to follow up on this.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think we're exactly on the same page. There is a heavy dose of Gramsci in this book and in my thinking. And another way to sort of describe the present is that it's not only a structural crisis in which, right, the planet is objectively burning up and care is legitimately, care is clearly, objectively being, right, cannibalized, but it's also a hegemonic crisis. And in the sense that the reigning common sense no longer goes without saying. For decades, there was some argument here and there, but the common sense was that, you know, there's too much state red tape and regulation. We need to liberate entrepreneurial, right, creativity and let the markets do their magic. I don't think anyone today, including, you know, all of the very nasty right-wing populists around the world, no one today believes that common sense any longer. There have been mass defections across the globe in nearly every country from the established rulers, the established political parties, the established political projects and common sense. I mean, just look at what's going on in Iran right now. So that there's a vacuum, and this is another aspect of the crisis. The question is, who will succeed in suturing together the components of a counter-hegemonic bloc? Who will be able to create a counter-hegemony? The crisis doesn't get resolved without that. It just continues to unravel everything and descend into barbarism. The resolution comes when some set of actors is able to create a certain a narrative, a diagnosis, a project that can woo all sorts of social forces within it. And so far, in the present moment, I guess we'd have to say that the right-wing populists in many places are the closest. I don't think they have achieved counter-hegemony, but they're the closest. They're in the best position right now to do that. They've been more successful than left-wing efforts, although we have had, you know, some recent left-wing electoral victories in Latin America. And, you know, we had the Sanders movement and so on in the United States, and Podemos and Syriza and so on, Corbyn, you know, there. But I would say that the principal forces, I'm taking a political kind of answer to your question. The principal forces that are contending are various strands of right-wing populism on the one hand, and those who are trying to re-hegemonize neoliberalism in one form or another. I called the US form, which is also that in many European countries, progressive neoliberalism, right? This is the neoliberalism that represents the sort of symbolic capital, Hollywood, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, these kind of cosmopolitan, seemingly forward-looking people, if one can still speak of Elon Musk that way. I don't, perhaps not, but their alliance with the liberal strands of social movements, liberal feminism, right, personified by, say, Hillary Clinton, liberal feminism, liberal LGBTQ movements, liberal environmentalism, and anti-racism, the so-called black faces in high places, kind of, right, anti-racism. What they're doing now, I think, is telling us that the fascists are at the door, and you need to scurry back behind our skirts and protect yourself, and drop all this radical egalitarian lefty stuff, and just, you know, close ranks with liberalism. And what I'm trying to do in this book is make the case at the political level that the only hope for an emancipatory resolution of this crisis is to develop a third force, and to try to split off working class segments from the right-wing populists, those who are not, diehard racist and, irredeemables, so to speak, and to split off working class elements that are still allied with progressive neoliberals. And by the way, when I say working class, I don't mean what people call the white working class in manufacturing. I mean this much larger group that, what I said about the essential workers and so on and so forth. The working class is, we've misimagined it. And if you take this larger view of capitalism that as a social order that shows how essential care work is and how essential various forms of dependent and expropriated work are, unfree or semi-free work. If you see how important those things are, you get a completely different picture of what the working class is. And then the problem is the divisions within it and how they have historically blocked a fully inclusive movement. So yeah, for me, the question of hegemony is absolutely central. I agree that with Gramsci that ruling classes, except in very extreme moments, very rare moments, don't rule by force alone, but by wooing consent and establishing their worldview as the natural common sense for everybody. And that the task of radicals or revolutionaries is to build a new common sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Your answer has left out the South altogether. Everything you discussed is about politics in the North. Would you not see the arena being more global?
I definitely see the arena as being global, and I didn't really mean to leave out the global South. I think that right-wing populism is everywhere in the global South, and Modi's India, and throughout Bolsonaro's Brazil. And so on and so forth. I don't think this. These forms look different in different places, but so do they look different in Europe versus the United States. No, I am trying to describe a global hegemonic crisis. And I would say that that forces there have been periods, and maybe we're entering another one, where Latin America especially is kind of the exceptional region that is trying to chart a different path, a more promising path. Although, as we saw in the last pink tide, it's not easy to go against the global investor classes and so on and so forth. So I look to the global South for vision and for radicalism in thought and in practice. Like I say, I think what's going on right now in Iran is quite extraordinary. But I have to say, as an American, I do think that the United States is the sort of the what did Khomeini call it? The great Satan in the world. I think we are. And, and any change that we can make here would have enormous effects elsewhere. Enormous. So, we should be trying to figure out, for example, how to oppose the sort of attempts to create a new Cold War now in relation to Russia and China. I mean, what should a left foreign policy be for the United States? I mean, you know, there's a huge kind of we're really struggling to get a grip on things like that, and we need to.
Thank you.
I'd like to call on Karsten Struhl again.
Something else in the book interested me and in your talk, which is the form of cannibalism where the serpent eats its own tail. And so I was trying to think of, okay, how does that translate into modern capitalism and your understanding of this being a capitalist society, not just capitalist economy? And I could think of a couple of things. Some of it's just the standard contradictions of capitalism, but I'm also thinking on the ecological level, capitalism eats up the conditions of its own existence. What else? I mean, how do you understand that whole eating of its tail?
So I try to map out a whole series of analytically distinct contradictions of capitalism, not just the intra-economic contradictions that Marx theorized, but also these Polanyian inter-realm contradictions, right? And I think that they all have, I treat them as analytically distinct, but of course they're all practically entwined. But in each case, I suggest that there is a similar logic in play, and that and I call it the 4D logic, because there are these D words that, to me. So first of all, there's the question of division. Capitalist societies divide states from economies. They divide production from reproduction. They divide nature as a sort of treasure trove of supposedly free gifts from the realm of labor and production and exchange and so on. So division is the first thing. The second thing is dependence. The accumulation process, it depends on these realms that it cannibalizes, okay? Then there's disavowal, that the society disavows the dependence. It hives off, as I said, responsibility for keeping in good order the things that are supposedly essential to it. And then the result is the fourth D word, that therefore there's a built-in tendency for this social order, for the economy to destabilize its own background conditions of possibility. Now, I'm using the word tendency in exactly Marx's sense. There can also be counter tendencies. It doesn't mean that they're always in the most acute way, right? And the most visible way, trashing the things it depends on. But the non repair and replenishment and so on does accumulate over time, and there are moments when there's a kind of a tipping point, and then the sort of that crisis tendency becomes an experienced actual crisis. I think that same story holds for the ecological, for the crisis of care. I think capitalism as a system has a chronic problem with the question of care. Where is it going to get the working class that it needs from? It wants to sort of not pay for it, for the labor that goes into assuring the supply of labor power. It wants to, it wants and it doesn't want immigrants. That's the alternative. If you're not going to support your domestic population social reproduction, then maybe you can, throw Black people into chains in the holds of ships and bring them over, or get more modern forms of immigrants, people whose social reproduction costs were paid for elsewhere. That's another sort of strategy, but in any case, there's the constant disavowal of the quote essential nature of this work. And as we see in neoliberalism, you're dragooning women into long hours of low wage paid service work at the same time that you're cutting state supported social provision. Well, okay, now we're back to sort of like what happened in the 19th century, where, Les Engels wrote about in the Manchester book, families can't reproduce in a way that will work for the system eventually. Something's got to give. Same logic, the same logic of hollowing out public power by tax havening, right? Tax revolts on the part of corporations, or regulatory capture, lobbying, all the ways in which the system is incentivizes the weakening of public power, except when they suddenly need it, usually in the form of repressive forces. So in each case, these are contradictions that kind of play out as crisis tendencies, extra economic crisis tendencies, an ecological crisis tendency, a social reproductive, a political one, and so on and so forth. That's how I see it.
I'd like to make one additional point about the pandemic. One of the things that I found striking was the emergence of mutual aid. While the state was failing us, civil society came to the rescue. And that often happens in moments of crisis. When the state, particularly the neoliberal state, is unable to deal with problems, the people take up the task themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And then for me, the political question would be, apart from the sort of urgency, right, of finding a way to cope in a disastrous situation, which forms of mutual aid and civil society creativity, which forms end up functioning as kind of safety valves on which, again, capital is free riding, as it's doing in all these other, and in which cases do these projects, actually set in motion a trajectory of system challenge how do we distinguish system conforming versions of mutual aid from those that are system challenging? I think that's the big question. But I agree with the premise, absolutely.
Okay, are there any other points, questions, or comments that anyone wants to share?
I just want to thank Nancy for this talk, as well as for producing the book. I look forward to reading the whole of it.
Thank you, Karsten, and thanks, Cliff, and everybody. It's been really enjoyable to talk with you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nancy, for this informative discussion, and I'm sure many people will look forward to reading your book. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, which you can access through our website, globaljusticecenter.org. And there you can also make donations to help support us. I hope you will join us next week, next Monday, when we will have a talk by Lauren Langman on American character and the clash of ideologies. So let me finally thank our webinar team, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, and myself. And now this is Cliff Duran signing off until next Monday.